versus Tiffany Moss, the defendant's present, along with standby counsel. State's counsel's present as well. I've received a note from one of the jurors. It'll be included in the record as Court's Exhibit number 5. It reads as follows: when I checked my phone this morning, I had a missed call. When I returned the call this morning, I was informed it was from the law firm of King & Spalding, signed and dated by one of the members. Obviously a juror that's taking their oath very seriously. There's no indication that they spoke with anybody there about this case or that it even had anything to do with this case. I'd be happy to inquire of the juror if you feel like that's in the best interest of all concerned. Perhaps probably is, just to be abundantly cautious. Any objection to bringing the juror in and just inquiring about the nature of this phone call on behalf of the state?
No, Your Honor. In thinking about resolving it, or what, if any, instructions to give to the juror, if it's established that the call was unrelated or that he didn't learn the nature of the call, then the only thing I can think of is that the court might warn him that if they contact him again and discuss this case, then that should be reported immediately. But that's the only remedy that I can think of.
Yeah, I think all we do is ask what happened and be guided based on the answers, I suppose. You agree, Ms. Moss?
Yes, sir.
All right, please bring... Yes, sir.
The lady, I believe she said she was the resource division. I asked who I was speaking with. She gave me her name. I asked again who was the company it was, and she said King & Spalding. She said she did not know what it was about. I told her thank you, that I would be in court today.
Okay, all right. But no one attempted to inquire about this case or say anything to you about this case?
And I had no conversations about this case.
Okay. If someone were to do that, if someone were to subsequently attempt to communicate with you about the case, obviously we would want you to report that to us immediately.
Yes.
Certainly appreciate you bringing this to our attention. Is there any additional questions by the state?
No, Your Honor.
By the defense?
Yeah.
All right, sir. You can go back and continue your deliberations.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. All right, the juror's out. It doesn't appear that anything improper occurred. Probably just a random phone call that happened to occur during the course of a particularly critical moment in the trial. But any additional action that the state would suggest the court needs to take?
No, Your Honor. If I had to guess, he was a reference for somebody on a job application.
Probably so. Any additional action that you would propose that I should take, Ms. Moss?
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. We'll be in recess till we hear further from the jury. Thank you. Turning to 18B 1541-1, State of Georgia versus Tiffany Nicole Moss, the defendant's present along with standby counsel, state's counsel's present as well. I am informed that we have a verdict. Please bring our jury. Yes, sir. You can be seated. Thank you very much. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm informed you have a verdict. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is it unanimous?
Yes, it is, Your Honor.
Has it been signed by your foreperson?
It has.
Please give it to the bailiff. This is the jury's verdict in case 18B 1541-1, State of Georgia versus Tiffany Nicole Moss. Count 1, findings of jury as to alleged statutory aggravating circumstances. We, the jury, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the offense of murder as alleged in Count 1 was outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible, or inhuman in that it involved torture of the victim before death. We, the jury, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the offense of murder as alleged in Count 1 was outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible, or inhuman in that it involved depravity of mind of the defendant. Signed and dated by the foreperson. Verdict as to penalty, Count 1, murder. We, the jury, recommend and fix the penalty as death. Signed and dated by the foreperson. Please give it to counsel for their review as to form, sir. Any exceptions to the form of the verdict by the state?
None from the state as to form or substance.
Any exceptions to the form of the verdict by the defense?
No, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, under these circumstances, it's necessary that the court conduct a poll of the jury. It simply means that I have a series of questions to ask you each individually. We'll begin with Juror 2, Ms. Muhammad. Ma'am, by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, ma'am. Juror 7. Ma'am, you've heard the verdict as I announced it. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, it was, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, it was, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, it is, Your Honor.
Thank you. Juror 8. Ma'am, you've heard the verdict as I announced it here in the courtroom. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you very much. 11, Walker. Ma'am, you've heard the verdict as I announced it. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes.
42. Sir, you've heard the verdict as I announced it here in the courtroom. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Juror 40. Sir, you've heard the verdict as I announced it. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Juror 49. You've heard the verdict as I announced it here in the courtroom. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, sir. Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Your Honor.
Sir, you've heard the verdict as I announced it. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
60, William. Heard the verdict as I announced it. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Sir, you've heard the verdict as I announced it. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Ma'am, you've heard the verdict as I announced it. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
Sir, you've heard the verdict as I announced it. Was that your verdict in the jury room?
Yes, Your Honor.
Was it freely and voluntarily made by you?
Yes, Your Honor.
Is it still your verdict?
Yes, Your Honor.
That whole of the jury. Any additional need to retain the services of this jury panel any further for the state?
No, Your Honor, the jury can be excused, but, and first of all, I want to thank the jury for their service throughout this trial, but there are going to be issues regarding the press and that it's entirely voluntary with them that may better come from the court.
I will instruct them on that, yes. Any additional need for the services of this jury panel any further, Ms. Moss?
No, sir, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all very much for your service. Obviously, getting the news that you had jury service, particularly on a case that was expected to last as long as this one might have, was probably not the most welcome news that you received that particular week. But I find that jurors that have actually had the opportunity to sit in on a case and serve understand the importance of jury service and the important role that jurors play in our criminal justice system, perhaps more than you might otherwise have appreciated it before. So I want to thank you all very much for your service in this case. I've repeatedly told you throughout this process that you should not discuss this case with anyone or allow anyone else to discuss the case with you or in your presence or hearing. I now relieve you of that obligation. You're free to speak with whoever it is that you might like to about the case. Sometimes the attorneys or other participants in the case like to talk with jurors because they'd like to have your insights into what it is that may have gone on during the trial. If the attorneys talk with you, it's not for the purpose of second-guessing any decisions that you might make, but like any professional, perhaps your insights would help them when they present cases in the future. Because of the level of press attention, you might also get approached by members of the press or others that are curious about your impressions about the case. You're certainly welcome to speak with all those people if you want to, but you're under absolutely no obligation to speak with any of them if you don't want to. And I'm sure if you explain to them that you'd prefer not to discuss the case, it won't bother you any further. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all very much for your service in this case, and you are excused. You can go out with our bellows.
Cheryl Preheim and Jennifer Bellamy in the 11 Alive newsroom. You heard the jury just being polled in the Tiffany Moss murder trial. The jury came back with a decision to sentence Tiffany Moss to death for the murder of her stepdaughter, Amani Moss. Amani Moss was 10 years old when her stepmother is now convicted of starving her to death. She now becomes the only woman currently on Georgia's death row.
Yeah, and the third only that would ever have been put to death. This is a case that many people have been following, and a lot of folks were wondering if the amount of time that the jury took would have any sort of impact on what we were actually going to see, because you'll remember there were the three options that the jurors had. They could have sentenced her to death, as they did today. They could have sentenced her to life in prison with parole and life in prison without parole. And I think it's interesting when we kind of look back to what we saw yesterday in those statements from the district attorney, Danny Porter.
Yeah.
He kind of tried to say, Amani's father is already in jail without parole. She deserves more, was essentially the message that he was giving to jurors, and it seems as if that likely resonated with them.
He made the argument that her father was a murderer because he did not step in to help his daughter, but he made the case, Danny Porter, the DA, saying that this is a woman who every day made a conscious decision to withhold food and have that neglect and abuse to intentionally cause the death of her stepdaughter. It is very interesting that yesterday, after just under 2 hours of deliberation, the jury sent a note to the judge that they were at an impasse, that they could not reach a conclusion. So about 5:30 yesterday evening, the judge let the jurors go for the day, saying, come back this morning and we'll try it again. Something happened between those hours of 5:30 last night and this morning that all of the jurors were able to come onto the same page and make a unanimous decision that they decided that Tiffany Moss should be sentenced to death for her crime against her stepdaughter, Amani.
Yeah, and all of this, again, was going on with Tiffany and Imani as the rest of the household kind of moved on as normal. The other children, two other children in that household, did not receive the same treatment that we saw with Imani. Also, we know that there's a case with Defects, the family working to get her out of this situation, that grandmother fighting for her. And so there's been a lot of issues in terms of that side of the case as well.
Robin Moss is her grandmother, who felt like there were some very, very scary things going on in the house and fought for many, many years to try to get Amani out of the house, calling Defects, asking them to intervene. Defects closed the case on Amani Moss about 3 or 4 months before her death. Robin Moss, the grandmother, is now in a lawsuit against Defects for what she calls neglect, saying that they could have prevented this death. So that part of justice for Amani is ongoing, but today we see the end of a chapter in the criminal proceeding against Tiffany Moss. The DA said this was a Cinderella story gone terribly wrong, calling this stepmother evil, saying that she was protecting her own I'm sorry, we're just getting word that the execution date has now been set for June between the 15th and the 17th, I believe is the date. I'm sorry,
7th and 14th.
I heard that wrong. 7th and the 14th. So the execution date for Tiffany Moss now set from June 7th to 14th in that window. We already know there will be appeals. We know there will be many appeals in this case, and we've heard our legal analyst, Latonio Hines, a prosecutor for Cobb County, say many times that just the fact that Tiffany Moss chose to represent herself and virtually had no defense in this case would be an automatic review. There will automatically be review in any death penalty case, but the fact that she represented herself and there was no defense in this case really adds a lot of complication to the appeal process. And there will no doubt be an appeal, but as of now, the execution date set for June 7th to the 14th. But just to finish that point about Tiffany Moss and her own daughter, she had 2 biological children in the house that Danny Porter, the DA, said were healthy and happy and were treated in every way a child should be treated, all the while Amani Moss was in a back bedroom and she was dying day to day.
Yeah, and when we go back to what we have seen throughout this case in terms of Tiffany Moss representing herself, we know throughout this case the district attorney in his office has been working to say, hey, we want to make sure that you know that this is happening. You will not get another chance, for example, to speak to this person, just to make sure that everything done was in order, to kind of cover the situation. And again, in these cases, there are always appeals, but they did work to try and make sure that she fully understood what was happening, that she had every opportunity to speak. And we saw time and time again, she said no, she did not cross-examine witnesses. She did not bring forth any witnesses or evidence herself. And also when it moved into that penalty phase, she didn't have anything to say, no statement, no witnesses to speak on her behalf, to her character.
Right.
She decided not to do any of that throughout this process. And we even heard from the district attorney, Danny Porter, yesterday saying this could be a crafty way to just get that one person. He said, I have to get everyone. And when we saw the jury polled, everyone on that jury said, yes, I have agreed and I have cast my ballot vote to say for the death penalty in this Tiffany Moss case. And Danny Porter said, I had to get all 12. She only had to get one person to say no. And so that was a big thing that they've been doing throughout this.
And keep in mind when you talk about a jury that 5:30 last evening were at an impasse, the jurors were at an impasse, and then this morning got on the same page. Remember that during the jury selection process, there were a number of jurors that were seated on this panel that said, I would find it very difficult to render a death sentence. I would find that personally very difficult. So imagine the journey that these jurors have been on, many of them from that point of saying that would be very difficult, I'm not sure I could do that, to being at an impasse just many hours ago to this morning being unanimous and telling the judge that they had all decided as a group of jurors that they felt like death was the appropriate sentence in this case. The appeals process will start now. If you're just joining us, Tiffany Moss has been sentenced to death for the murder of her stepdaughter, Amani, who was 10 years old at the time of her death. The DA laid out a case of a stepmother who diabolically, day by day, withheld food, other abuse and neglect as well, and starved her stepdaughter to death, even as the stepdaughter's grandmother was fighting to try to get her out of that home. Her biological father was in the home and did nothing to stop it. Iman Moss is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. This is a historic day for Georgia because Tiffany Moss now becomes the only woman on Georgia's death row. The last woman to be executed was Kelly Gissendanner. She was executed in 2015, convicted of the murder of her husband. Before that, it was 1945. Lena Baker in Randolph County, but Lena Baker was posthumously pardoned after her execution. So the only third woman to face death here in Georgia, depending on how the appeals process goes. But Tiffany Moss, the only woman on Georgia's death row. There are 50 men currently on Georgia's death row.
And when we talk about the process that this jury had to go through to not only find Tiffany Moss guilty on all charges related to the death of Imani, but also to find her her crime so bad, so heinous that they wanted to sentence her to death. I think it's interesting because all throughout this case, it has been very difficult to listen to, and we haven't even seen everything that those jurors had to look at, that they had to hear. And we've had portions where the judge was warning people throughout the courtroom that if you can't take it, you should excuse yourself. And I think that some of the information that they actually heard and saw in that courtroom likely played a major role in them making the decision that they did today to sentence her to death.
I was looking for the exact verbiage of what they had to decide. They had to decide it was outrageously, wantonly vile, horribly inhuman, involving torture, depravity of the mind. And the district attorney laid it out very clearly on the stages of starvation. It was very hard to hear that as a human being, let alone a parent. And during those conversations with the jurors during that closing statement, I saw Doug Richards tweet out that he saw at least 4 jurors wiping tears away as they were listening to the closing arguments. We saw many jurors crying as the medical examiner talked about the condition of this little girl, a little girl who weighed 32 pounds as a 10-year-old. 32 pounds is what a 3-year-old would typically weigh if they are healthy, and this little girl was 10. During the course of this criminal trial, Amani Moss would have turned 16 years old on April 23rd. So some justice for Amani in the conviction of her stepmother. And I know this will be probably a divisive decision because the death penalty is very divisive in our country, in our community, in our state. There will be an appeals process, but the jury decided unanimously today that this was outrageously and wantonly vile, horrible, inhuman, inhuman and involved torture and depravity, and came to that decision as a group unanimously.
Exactly. Danny Porter mentioning during his remarks during the penalty phase that this was a decision that she made each and every day to deprive Amani of what many of us consider basic essentials for life.
Food, water.
And she just made the decision not to give it to her and to give it to the other children inside that home. But for those jurors, they're probably also looking back and saying this isn't the first time that there was an issue here, that Tiffany Moss had been involved in another issue with abuse of Imani earlier in her lifetime.
2010.
And, exactly, and that had happened previously. Tiffany and Iman, her father, both did whatever they needed to do to get her back into the home. And that kind of ties into what we saw with Defects as well. But this was not the first time. Iman, the father, testifying that the relationship changed even further after that happened because Tiffany was not able to continue her career in early childhood education.
Right.
And it was just so many things that layer upon layer that I think probably played a part in what we're seeing with that guilty verdict and now with that decision from the jury today.
You make a really good point, because a lot of the DA's argument was about overtime, and he was talking about the 60 days leading up to her death, but there were many, many years that Amani Moss suffered neglect and abuse, and that is very well documented. Tiffany Moss pleaded guilty in 2010, the case that you were just alluding to beating Amani. They were able to get her back into custody. They were on probation for 5 years, but the district attorney saying for more than 8 or 9 years, most of her life, that this is a little girl who did not get love and nurturing and care, and then on the far end of that received horrible treatment and abuse that led to her death. And then another part of this charge was that they tried to conceal her death. After she was gone, there were text messages exchanged between her stepmother and her father talking about how to hide this death, how to lie about it, how to say they were going to say that she ran away and just never came home, and involved discussions about how to hide their crime.
Cover this up. And Amani had run away in the past.
Asking for help.
Yes, trying to get away from this situation. And I think that just plays on, I mean, it's unimaginable for most people that this kind of situation could happen and continue to happen, especially with the father. When you hear people talking about this and commenting on our social media pages, people are saying, why didn't the father do something? This is his child.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a very tough thing for anyone to wrap their mind around this happened and that it continued to happen for such a long time.
And we talk about the details of this case, and we talk about the horrendous scenario that played out, and then a death sentence being rendered today, and still today, no emotion from Tiffany Moss. She did not look at the jurors in court as they one by one told the judge that yes, we agree to the decision that has been made. Never once looked at them. She never had any emotion when the medical examiner talked about everything that Amani had gone through and the state of her body when they found her, even as the jurors were crying in the jury box. No emotion from Tiffany Moss, and no emotion from Iman Moss on the stand as he talked about watching this treatment happen to his daughter and not doing anything to step in.
Yeah, I'm following along with our Kaitlyn Ross, who has been inside that courtroom as this trial has progressed. And she said that Tiffany Moss's mother and sister were not present today for this sentencing phase. She said that they had been here every single day until she had been found guilty. We know that Tiffany's mom left yesterday right after that verdict, that guilty on all charges verdict, and then declined speaking with anybody else. But that's also an interesting portion of this because they also testified. They were called by the DA's office to talk about what happened, and sister talking about celebrating a birthday at one point with Tiffany, had no knowledge that something was wrong, that this was all happening as Amani was still continuously suffering.
So what happens next? In a capital murder trial, when someone's been sentenced to death, there's an automatic review of the case. She has the right to file an appeal. It will be interesting if she does, because she never had an opening statement. She never called a witness, had no closing statement. Ultimately, it will be her decision. Her backup attorneys were fighting to try to get involved at the last minute before the jury went back to decide if she'd spend life in prison without parole or be sentenced to death. but she did not want that. It'll be interesting to see what she does moving forward, but there will be an automatic review of the proceedings that many of you watched unfold. The judge has set a date for the execution for June 7th to 14th. That's the window. That means that unless there is an appeal process or something is stopped, Tiffany Moss would be executed by lethal injection in about 2 months. So that is a fast timeline, but very rarely does anything happen fast when we're talking about a capital murder case and an execution. Again, there's not been a woman executed in the state of Georgia since 2015.
Yeah, and it'll be very interesting to see if any of those jurors are willing to speak about the process that they went through in making this decision. It is their choice to say, yes, I would like to talk about this, or no, I would not. They also could be approached. The judge gave them this information before they were dismissed, that you also might be approached by attorneys just to kind of see what kind of went through your mind as you were gathering this information and making that final decision, and also other legal professionals, because they do use this information in future cases. But it would be very fascinating to see what those jurors felt, what they thought, and how they ultimately arrived at this decision. You mentioned several of them crying at different points. I remember Kaitlyn saying they were trying to take notes and someone's hands was just shaking so much, just listening to this information from those witnesses that were testifying. And so that is going to be a big part of this. Hopefully we will get to hear from them.
I was thinking about when the judge said, thank you for your service and you're free to go. You know, they're free to go out of the courtroom, but this never leaves them. No. They will always be the person who sat on the capital murder trial of Tiffany Moss, the woman who was convicted of being this evil stepmother. They will always remember what the medical examiner said. They will always think of Amani, I imagine. They'll always think of that metal trash can that was so prominent in the courtroom yesterday as the judge was telling them, now you must decide if she pays for her crime with her life. These are the things they'll always carry with them. And these are people just like you or I who just got an envelope in the mail one day saying you're summoned to jury duty, and you show up and you have no idea what case you might get called to. And this was the case they were called to. I was just in jury duty a few weeks ago. And you walk in and you wonder what you might be assigned to do or if you'll be dismissed. These are people just like you or I who were on this jury at this appointed time and had to make this life or death decision. I thought about that the entire time this case was unfolding.
Yeah, certainly life altering for all of them as well, and anyone who sat there and watched and listened throughout this. Danny Porter, in his comments to the jury during that penalty phase, saying, I don't envy you.
Right.
This is a hard decision, but he also tried to comfort them in some ways, saying that, you know, sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy. And that was part of the remarks. He also mentioned that, in his opinion, he did not think that Tiffany Moss would be the kind of person who would sit in jail if she was sentenced to life in prison without parole, that she would reflect on what she had done. And that was part of his remarks and his argument for why she did deserve the ultimate punishment, because he did not think that. He said she was evil. Yeah. And he said that it was going to come out again if she was released on parole ever. And so some very strong words from him trying to make that argument that the jury ultimately did come to agree with.
He was really speaking to them, knowing what objections might come in their mind. He said, if you're thinking about, well, she could spend the rest of her life in prison and feel remorse and think back on this and maybe be rehabilitated, maybe change it around. And I think you and I were both so struck by that. We both took notes about exactly what he said. He said, she has shown too much of herself, too much of the evil within her, too much of the cruelty within her. There's a dark side in this woman that will always be waiting to come out. That was the DA's argument to any of the jurors who might be thinking, well, the penalty to sit in jail every day for the rest of her life and think about what she did might be more appropriate. And again, the biological father of Iman Moss is serving that sentence because he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. He agreed to testify against her, to talk in detail about what he saw unfold in that house, to talk about the times he did not step in even though he knew his daughter was in trouble, and the great lengths they went through together to try to cover up this crime. For that, he serves life in prison without the possibility of parole. And Danny Porter said there are some crimes that you must pay the balance with what happened next. But we heard so many of a defendant choosing other than saying, yes, Your Honor, I understand at this time. Beyond that, we did not hear a word come out of Tiffany Moss's mouth, and no emotion on her face, except for today when she walked in, she smiled at her backup attorneys. Yeah. But beyond that, I never saw any emotion. I don't think Kaitlyn Ross, through the entire course of this, she's been tweeting in great detail about what's happened, and that really struck her as well, that she'd not seen that either. Yeah, and we do know that as with all of these types of cases, Tiffany Moss did go through an evaluation to clear her to be able to represent herself, so to speak, and was approved and able to kind of move forward in that process as her own counsel. And I mean, we have what we have at this point, as she did go through that and was cleared to do so. And you know, I think they said she provided no defense at all. I think that was what many people have just called it, a defense with no defense. Right. Because all she did was really kind of cordially respond to any questions or orders or requests from the judge. There was nothing, no evidence. And again, not even in the penalty phase where it may have made a difference in the jury's decision whether to allow her to be in jail or sentence her to death. There was nothing. She didn't call a family member or a friend to come speak on her behalf. Right, that's true. Didn't document, didn't provide any sort of documentation about her career, her background, her life. She provided nothing that might have swayed a jury to say, maybe she can change. Maybe this was just one little thing. She provided nothing to give them anything to kind of hook on with that. And I did think it was interesting, though. You mentioned we have been talking to attorneys throughout this process. Right. Some of them thought that the longer it took the jury, that might impact or, you know, have some sort of factor into what we were seeing in terms of the jury's actual decision. So I don't think a lot of people were expecting them to take this stance, given them wanting to sleep on it, so to speak, or to go home and then come back the next day. The longer the time is, I guess there's that thought that, okay, people might shy away from the death penalty, and that's not what we saw today. Yeah, it was interesting. Latonia Hines, the prosecutor from Cobb County, said yesterday the guilty verdict, in her opinion, was a slam dunk. The harder decision she thought would be sentencing. But if you look at the time of the deliberation on both, the deliberation for the guilty versus not guilty was about 3.5 hours. And pretty similar in this case. I think I wrote down at 3:16 yesterday, the judge let the jury go to start their process after they got their full instructions. At 5:30 is about the time the jury came back and said, we're at an impasse. We want to take a break and call it a day, and then went home for the night. They came back at 9 this morning, and by 10 we had their sentence. So again, we're talking about 3 hours for both, which is interesting, a little less for the sentencing phase. So would be fascinating to hear what happened inside that juror room this morning for that hour, as they maybe came back, took another vote where people are at, had more conversation, and then came in and told the judge one by one that they agreed with this sentence. If you are just joining us, I'm Cheryl Preheim along with Jennifer Bellamy in the 11 Alive newsroom, as we've been bringing you continuous coverage of the Tiffany Moss trial. This morning, a jury made their sentence known, that they say that she should die by lethal injection, be executed for her crime, the murder of her stepdaughter, 10-year-old Imani Moss. Amani was 10 years old, weighed what a 3-year-old should weigh, and the judge has already assigned an execution date for June 7th through the 14th. They give a window knowing there's an appeal process, but if there is not an appeal that stops this process, Tiffany Moss could die by lethal injection in Georgia in about 2 months for the crime against her stepdaughter. It's unlikely that will happen. Appeals processes can take a very long time, but the date has been set. She now becomes the only woman in Georgia to be on death row. There are currently 10 men in that position. And we've been saying that this is such an emotional decision. I'm sorry, 50 men. Oh, I did not mean to say 10. 50 men. There are 50 men on death row in Georgia. Sorry. We're saying that this is such an emotional decision for jurors. So many people throughout the country have a really strong opinion on whether or not people should be put to death or not. And it's very difficult for them to make this choice in there, especially we're seeing yesterday afternoon, they were at that impasse. I was speaking with Latonya after her segment with you yesterday evening, and she was talking about, you know, after we got that information that the jury said they'd like to go home and come back fresh today,
she was saying, you know, technically that's very difficult because you aren't supposed to
Talk to
talk
anyone.
to anyone.
Yes, can you
and
imagine?
any time that you're making any sort of difficult decision, it's natural to
go home.
to speak with your loved ones, your friends, people that you trust,
so
and to
true.
not be able to do that, and then have this heavy decision that you have to make is something that all of those jurors and the alternates had to do before they came back. I do want to mention also there was a brief note from the jury this morning. One juror said that they received missed a phone call, called back, and it was
Interesting,
It
huh?
was from a law firm, and they did not speak with anyone at that law firm, but they did. I guess looks like they wanted to do the right thing and make it known that this happened.
Very smart.
And so that was taken care of. That was handled and addressed earlier this morning. That was seems like the only thing that we heard this morning.
And that was some diligence on the jurors' part. They
Yes.
don't want anything on a technicality to start the process all over when they had gotten that far. For those of you who might be new to our state, Amani Moss, she was found November 2nd of 2013. This has been a very long process. She would have been 16 this month on April 23rd. She was 10 at the time of her death. So this criminal proceeding has taken quite some time. This has been a case that's been on the desk of the District Attorney's Office in Gwinnett County for a very long time, and DA Danny Porter is expected to talk very soon. As soon as he does, we will bring that interview to you live here, because this is something they really went aggressively after. They knew this was an important case. They felt very, very sure that it required a death penalty case, and they decided to go in that direction. They said it was appropriate to offer a plea to the father so that he could help reinforce this case. They said they feel that it is appropriate that he is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. So after many, many years, after almost 6 years now, the end of this case has happened in terms of the end of the criminal proceeding before appeals process. But sometimes, you know, you have to really think back. The timeline started at that point, but started so far beyond that. Started when this child was a baby and a very little girl, so 10 years even before that. So the end of, gosh, you know, a 16-year journey here for her grandmother and people who loved her. And there were people who loved her. There were people who really loved Imani and saw her potential and fought to try to bring her into a happy and healthy life, but were not able to do that because the system really failed her. Failed her in terrible ways. There were time after time documented that this was a little girl in trouble, whether it be from her grandmother, from her teacher at school, times she ran away, times calls were made, and they just could not get her out of there in time.
Yeah, awful situation. From the very start, even a lot of folks keep asking what happened to Imani's birth mother. Where is she in all of this? And we do know that she gave up. She surrendered her parental rights when Imani was an infant. And so that mother was not there in the picture throughout the course of her life. She was with her father. And looking back over the case, it said that Iman used to take Imani to church with him. And that is even where he met Tiffany. And that's when that portion of that story began. And so it's so difficult to know that even in the beginning, there was something there. And then that it just kind of continued and continued on, especially when you consider the fact that there were those other children inside the house that were not subjected to what Imani was subjected to, that they were dressed up for Halloween, that they were enjoying life and
Celebrating
that wasn't the
birthdays.
same. Yeah, and it was not the same for her. It seems very unfair, and it's so heartbreaking to hear the details of what happened. But hopefully, as a result of what we're seeing now and a result of Imani's grandmother and her action, we will see changes for other children going forward.
There have already been a lot of changes
Yes,
at
that's
Defects.
true.
At least 3 people were fired immediately when that came to light. Other people were disciplined. There was a full review. A lot of things have changed, including the head of the
Leadership,
department,
yes.
the leadership changes. So that prompted some change right away. But I think there's always an ongoing battle, you know, to fight for children who don't have a voice,
Exactly.
and things are happening behind closed doors. So In terms of the death penalty here, it's interesting to think about the history of that, not just for our state, but for our country. We've talked about that this is one of those topics that people are very divided on and feel very strongly about their personal position. The last death penalty case was Adrian Hargrove in Augusta, 2014. That's the last one we had here in Georgia. In the United States, only 16 women have been executed since 1976. That's when the Supreme Court lifted the moratorium on capital punishment. So there were others before that time, but that's kind of a benchmark that they look towards. So 16 women across the country since 1976. One of them after 1976 was Kelly Gissendaner here in Georgia. That was in 2015. Tiffany Moss would become the third woman executed in Georgia in history, dating back to 1945, but the woman who was executed in 1945 was posthumously pardoned after her death.
Yeah, and there has been a lot of discussion over the death penalty recently. We saw within the last few months out in California that the governor there took all the stuff out of the death chamber
So
there.
we're not doing that, yeah.
And essentially it comes down to during his tenure, because
Yeah.
another governor could come in and change it because it's not in the laws at this point. But we are seeing different attitudes and
Yeah.
people trying to take action. Clearly, the jury felt that this crime was so heinous and so terrible and so awful that they did feel that this punishment was just and was fitting for Tiffany Moss, given what they found her guilty of the previous day, the murder, the trying to conceal the death, the abuse that Imani suffered over quite some period of time.
It's interesting because when we talk about everyone's personal feeling about the death penalty, and a number of jurors came in saying very openly in court what their personal feeling was about it and that they did not feel comfortable with it, yet something changed their mind in the course of the proceeding. That there were jurors in that room who came in feeling one way, and they may have left feeling the same way, but had to make an action maybe that was different than what they thought they'd ever have to do. We may or may not ever hear from these jurors. We heard the judge say you might get approached, you might be asked for an interview. Some of them might feel like it's important to share their thought process, to talk about what happened, perhaps to talk about why they did this, maybe for justice for Amani or their thoughts. And some may say, I never want to talk about it again. It will be interesting to see if we hear from any of those jurors. That is absolutely up to them and their personal decision if they feel comfortable sharing the experience they went through. I'm sure that this was more emotional than anyone could have ever anticipated and maybe even put words to now. I imagine that in the weeks to come, some of this will actually sink in a way that they don't even feel now. This was a relatively short process for a trial of this importance and this magnitude.
It went by very quickly, and that was due to Tiffany Moss not putting up any defense at all.
We're talking
Not
about
speaking,
a week.
not cross-examining. And, you know, I think it's interesting when you look at that we saw that she did not have anything to say. She did not cross-examine. She did not present any opening, closing, penalty phase statements. It's also interesting that during the jury selection process, it seemed as if she was more engaged in terms of asking questions and asking jurors, could you give the death penalty? What is your relationship to Danny Porter in one instance? So it's interesting to see that change that happened from her being possibly more involved during that jury selection phase and then coming to this point during the trial where she had nothing really to say other than respectfully responding to the judge.
And up till now, she has not invoked any of her rights to have those standby attorneys that were always sitting right behind her, ready to jump in if she had just given the word. But we have just learned the standby attorney has told the judge they will make an appeal in the death penalty decision. They're going to appeal the death penalty decision, and the verbiage was that there are obvious grounds for appeal. And we would just assume that the obvious grounds for appeal are the fact that Tiffany Moss did not have an opening statement, did not call a witness, did not question a witness, had no closing statement, had no defense at all. So this is the first time we have seen the standby attorney really have the okay to make a move. They tried very hard. We heard their argument yesterday, trying very hard to ask the judge, let us step in. Whether Tiffany Moss wants us to step in or not, please let us step in, essentially to fight for her life in that sentencing phase. But the judge said it's she has the right to decide if she wants counsel. She has said she does not want counsel, but they really made an effort to try to jump in, to fight for her life, to fight for life with or without parole. So today, just now, the standby attorney has said for certain they will file an appeal in the death penalty sentence, saying there's obvious grounds for an appeal here. So we'll see how that appeal process plays out and how it may or may not affect the execution date the judge has set for June 7 to 14, somewhere in that week.
Also interesting because yesterday when we came to the sentencing phase, the standby attorneys had been working on information to present.
They were ready.
They were ready.
Yeah.
Tiffany Moss did not want that. And I mean, who knows what it was that they had prepared, if they had someone who could speak on her behalf, or if they had just, information about her life that may have struck a juror and made them kind of say, I can't do that to her.
Yeah.
But she said, I don't want that. Those efforts, as you said, have been made throughout this. The standby attorneys haven't just been standing by, they've been working and ready to move in and do whatever they could on her behalf. But she has said no throughout this entire process. And I mean, even at that, even after the guilty verdict, that opportunity was still there.
Yeah, it'd be so interesting to understand her thought process about that. And I was just thinking as you were talking, Jennifer, there are two other children in this equation. There are Tiffany Moss's two children who now their mother has been sentenced to death. Their father is in jail, prison, life without parole, and now, their lives are forever changed as well. The ripple effects of these crimes run very, very deep. Again, we're waiting for the District Attorney Danny Porter there in Gwinnett County to step up to the microphone. He'll give some remarks, talk about the process, talk about the state's view on the case, the county's view on the case. As soon as he gets to the podium, we'll let you listen in to his remarks as well. But there's still a lot happening behind the scenes there in the Gwinnett County Courthouse.
Yes, Sharon, as you were mentioning that those standby attorneys have said that they will appeal this death penalty decision. Our producer just telling me that our legal analyst, Latonya Bean-Hines, has said that this will delay the entire process.
Okay.
So that date that we had heard previously, that
June
range
7.
of June 7th through the 14th, that will delay those dates. We knew that that was very, very extremely likely that that would happen. And so that just lengthens this entire process for her family that's kind of been through a lot already, that this will just continue on as this appeal goes forward.
And you see in death penalty cases, appeals can take many, many years. Absolutely not uncommon for that to happen. And simultaneously, Robin Moss, the grandmother of Amani, is still in a lawsuit with Defects about what she says was a failure of the system to save her granddaughter. And I did want to take a minute just to share a little bit more about Imani, this beautiful little girl. Every time I see her picture, it just kind of makes my heart ache a little bit. This beautiful girl in her pigtails, a 10-year-old, her grandmother says she had taken ballet classes, she loved music, she loved reading, and she loved cooking. Her teacher was on the stand in tears saying that she was such a sweet-hearted little girl who came to class and was really caring about everyone else and thinking about how they were doing and brightened the classroom. And she was doing that when all of this was happening at home. All these things we're hearing about now were happening to her, and she still was going to school, working hard, a good student, and a light in that classroom. And just never want to forget that this is really about Amani.
A life. A life. That teacher saying she'll never forget Imani's smile.
Yeah.
And that's just what makes it that much more heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for something awful like this to happen to anyone, but to know that it's a child, someone who does not have the abilities, the resources that an adult might have.
Yeah.
It's just very tough. It's very tough.
If you're just joining us, I'm Cheryl Preheim with Jennifer Bellamy in the 11 Alive newsroom following the Tiffany Moss trial. After an hour of deliberations this morning, a jury that had been at an impasse at 5:30 last night, saying they could not come to an agreement completely whether Tiffany Moss should be sentenced to death for her crime or go to prison for life, came back and said, we are sentencing her to die by lethal injection in the state of Georgia, and they came to that decision unanimously after roughly 3 hours of deliberation. This all happening very quickly because it was just yesterday, after 3.5 hours of deliberation, they came back with a guilty verdict, and then after getting some instruction and about 3 more hours, they had a couple of hours, went home, thought about it, slept on it, came back this morning and rendered their verdict. So Tiffany Moss sentenced to death for the murder of her 10-year-old stepdaughter, Amani Moss. The standby attorneys have already stepped in, said they will file an appeal. There's automatically a review of a death penalty case, but they said for obvious reasons they will file an appeal in this case, so we will see how it plays out in the months and perhaps years to come. And we're waiting for the district attorney to give his remarks.
Yeah, and I do want to point out we're getting some information that even as this the standby attorneys are filing this appeal, there could be other appeals filed from others as
Sure.
well.
Right.
Different organizations in the community throughout the nation could file appeals on Tiffany Moss's behalf as well, and that could also further impact how long this process will continue to take. And that's something that you just don't think about.
Right.
That is also an option that we'll have to continue to look for and see if that happens.
That's a really good point, because there are organizations all over the country
Yeah.
who feel that the death penalty is never an appropriate sentence, and always come together no matter what state, no matter what circumstances, and work to save the lives of the convicted and those who are sitting on death row. So that will play out as well.
It certainly will. I've just been looking at some of the tweets that we have from Kaitlyn Ross, who is out there, and I'm trying to see exactly what she's kind of been saying. She's been keeping us updated with what's going on out there, saying a social worker had actually carried out all the clothes that we've seen Tiffany Moss wearing throughout this 7-day or so trial. And that's just some of the newest information that we're seeing from out there in Gwinnett County as this process is still kind of going through. There are those things that kind of have to happen,
Yeah.
Meaning that she's likely on her way back to incarceration.
Because she will no longer need civilian clothing.
Exactly.
She will be in her prison gear for now the rest of her life,
Yes.
unless she comes back into court for an appeals process. But and also they removed all the evidence out of the courtroom as well. There was a
Yes.
point yesterday that Jennifer and I just looked at each other as the instructions were being given after District Attorney Danny Porter gave a pretty impassioned plea to the jury to come back with a sentence for the death penalty. And we just looked and we noticed that silver metal trash can where they found her body was behind him, just right in behind the attorney, but right in front of the judge, and it had just been there the whole time. And there were a few times he referenced that, and we just both looked at each other and took a pause, knowing the jurors were seeing that too, as he made his kind of final statement to them before they went back to deliberate. All the evidence now being stored back away as well, because that will probably be part of perhaps an appeal as well.
And that evidence did go back with the jury as they were making their deliberations. That was something that you were able to do. You were able to see, and Tiffany Moss was able to inspect all of the evidence again before it went back with the jury. But I mean, I can't even imagine having that sitting there with you as you are contemplating these decisions, whether or not to find her guilty on these charges, whether or not her life being taken in the death penalty is an appropriate action to take, with those reminders in the room with you, those pictures, whatever else that was presented by the prosecutors. That just makes it that much more real as you're sitting there.
Yeah. Just the timeline of this entire case, it was November 2nd of 2013 that Amani Moss's body was found. And today we have a verdict in that case and a death sentence in that case. The jury deliberated 3 hours to find her guilty. They deliberated about 2.5 hours to sentence her to death. The entire trial taking 7 days. The reason it went so quickly is because there was no defense. There was no other side of that equation. No cross-examination, no witnesses called, no opening or closing statements, but a really, really fast proceeding for a case of this magnitude, so that being the timeline of that case. But the DA laid out abuse and neglect that happened many years prior to Amani Moss's death. Social workers were also part of the process, of course, because there are other 2 children involved, and because they're minors, we likely won't know what happens to them, but to see what they've been through too. Even though we can say they were healthy and happy inside the home, they were cared for, they had birthday parties, they were fed, there was food in the pantry, it was just withheld from Tiffany Moss, but they were still in a home where another child was dying day to day, and that is something you never forget.
Never, and especially as those children grow up, they'll know that this happened in their household, and I can't imagine what type of toll that will play on them. As well with the rest of the family, we do know that there's grandmothers on both sides that have been in the courtroom with this. We know that Amani's paternal grandmother was fighting for her. But we do also know that her maternal grandmother was there, except for today, throughout this trial.
Tiffany Moss's mother
Yes.
was there. To your point, Jennifer, Kaitlyn Ross, who is in the courthouse right now, just tweeted that Amani's grandmother just walked out of court. She didn't want to talk to the media, understandably, but says she thinks Amani got justice. The quote is, "I give it all to God. He took care of it." She was very overwhelmed as she left, said it was all just too much, because this day for her is a culmination of many, many years of heartache and worry about her granddaughter feeling like she was in jeopardy, and then her worst fears were realized when Amani died. And she's been through this entire process fighting for her, and felt like this court case was also part of that fight, and was in there every day, including today, and just left. And we may hear from her more maybe in the weeks to come. But again, she said, "I give it all to God. He took care of it." She really feels like today Amani got justice.
Yeah, and this is a long time coming for this grandmother. You know, from the time you said about 16, Amani would have turned 16 April 23rd. So from her birth until the point where, you know, her mother terminated her parental rights, then seeing this abuse case earlier on, and then knowing that something's wrong. I can't imagine her feeling knowing that something's wrong and trying to change it, but it not coming through, it not happening. And then for this to happen, I can't imagine what she's gone through. I imagine she said she gave it all to God, but I can imagine that this resolution is only a small fraction of what could even, not even make her feel better, but just, you know, get justice for Imani. I mean,
Yeah.
it's, I'm sure she's happy and, well, she's pleased rather with the decision from the jury, at least the guilty verdicts portion, but
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like it's enough.
Yeah, because you often hear families say, "Nothing brings my loved one
Exactly.
back, but I can make a difference for another daughter, another son, another child," and she's certainly committed to doing that in Amani's name, a way that Amani will never be forgotten and will be part of the fabric of perhaps a better future for other children in our state and beyond. And I know that is her grandmother Robin Moss's hope. But yeah, I cannot even fathom what she has been through. And today is just maybe the close of one of so many chapters for her. If you're just joining us, Tiffany Moss has been sentenced to death for the murder of her 10-year-old stepdaughter, Amani Moss, who was 32 pounds at the time of her death. She was 10 years old, weighing what a average 3-year-old might weigh. And the district attorney, Danny Porter, laid out a very passionate plea that there are some crimes that the only way to pay that debt is by your life. And that is what he told the jurors as they went to deliberate whether she would be sentenced to death or life in prison with parole or without parole. And after about 2.5 hours of deliberation this morning, they came back and said they had agreed as a jury team to sentence Tiffany Moss to death. The judge set a execution date for June 7th to the 14th, although we have already heard from the standby attorneys that they will appeal that process, so that will delay that process. They will make appeals, as is always the case in a death penalty case, and that case will be reviewed. But that is where the case stands out as of now, that a jury of her peers, citizens like you and I in Gwinnett County who came into jury duty not sure what case they'd be on, were on this capital murder case and had to come to this decision. Today, they're free to go. They may or may not talk about their experience, but what a week they have had.
And this is something that it's not just a majority rules type of situation. Every single juror serving on that had to come to the decision that, yes, I am in favor of Tiffany Moss having been found guilty of all these charges, should be put to death for what she did to her stepdaughter, Imani. We even heard the polling. If you were with us earlier you heard the polling where the judge went through and asked every juror by name and number, is this your verdict? Is this a decision that you made freely on your own? And each and every one of them had to say yes for this to continue on. And so that was a difficult decision, I'm sure, for many of them, because as we've been saying, some of them said they expressed difficulty with putting someone to death at the onset of this trial. And somehow, whatever happened, whatever information they heard, whatever discussions they had in that jury room, led them to say, I am now, at least in this case, in favor of Tiffany Moss receiving the death penalty.
Tiffany Moss is now the only woman on Georgia's death row. There are 50 men currently on Georgia's death row. If the appeals process does not prevent her execution, she would become the third woman in the history of our state to be executed. She would be executed by lethal injection. There will be appeals happening now. It could be a very long process. We will keep following the developments in this case. We are standing by to hear from the District Attorney, Danny Porter. We'll have more of that on 11alive.com throughout the day. We'll have team coverage for you on 11 Alive at 5 and 6. Kaitlyn Ross has been in the courtroom every moment of this trial. Doug Richards has been there too. They're talking to a lot of the people involved. So we encourage you to stay with our special coverage, as there's a lot more that will unfold throughout the day. But we appreciate you joining us here on 11alive.com.